newsmaker or a journalist. And the pictures on your screens are coming to you live from Ngara and the Central Business District here in Nairobi, where, as you can see, police have sealed off major roads in the city and those leading to State House, with sections of military spotted in Nairobi. And this is a day after President William Ruto made a dramatic U-turn and withdrew contentious tax hikes following anti-finance bill protests. We are bringing you pictures live from parts of the country where there's heavy police deployment as protesters are held at bay following anti-finance bill protests that have been happening since Tuesday this week. And even as we bring you those pictures, we are expecting the High Court to deliver a ruling on whether it will issue orders stopping the deployment of military officers to control the ongoing protests in parts of the country. This is after Defense CS Eden Duale announced the deployment of the military following the anti-finance bill protests. And according to Duale, the deployment was in response to the security emergency caused by the violent protests in various parts of the country. We are awaiting that High Court ruling on whether or not there will in fact be a deployment. And this, of course, triggering mixed reactions from sections of the country. The LSK, in its court papers, arguing that no emergency, unrest or instability has been officially declared to warrant the deployment of the military. With me is Gunjo Mathenge. He is a constitutional lawyer. This court ruling was to happen at 3 p.m. Wakili. As of now, we have not heard from the court.
Yes,
and we do not know what the way forward is. Yes. But just going back to the LSK and what it means by, saying that the Gazette notice should have been given 24 hours
earlier.
And looking at Parliament's approval and the 24-hour deadline. Let's talk into that and what weight that holds.
Yes, Lillian, when all this happened, first, the reason why LSK is in court is twofold. There is a procedural challenge and there is also a substantive challenge into the deployment of the KDF into the streets within the borders. The Constitution of Kenya envisages such a scenario where the KDF may be deployed within the confines of our republic. And that can only happen when a certain procedure is followed, and that procedure is articulated under Article 241 of the Constitution. And therein, what the Constitution provides is that we start with the Cabinet Secretary requesting approval of the National Assembly. And when he requests that, he ought to give the reasons of that. He ought to show what is this emergency or what is this seriousness that will call the deployment of the KDF. He will also enumerate to the National Assembly the period or the duration within which the Kenya Defence Forces shall be deployed to the streets or within the Republic. He will also say in which place and in which location will the KDF be deployed, so that they are not deployed indiscriminately in any part of the Republic. Therein lies our problem with the CS for Defense, Honorable Aden Duale. Because you will remember, he issued that Gazette notice on an evening without the approval of the National Assembly. The following morning, very early, the National Assembly convened, and within 30 minutes, they had discussed that request and approved. Whereas the Gazette notice, had been gazetted a day earlier. So it was a case of shooting first and then aiming later. And that is where our problem is, despite also having an issue with the substance of that deployment. Because that deployment ought to be done within the confine of the law, and there has to be a reason. Is it that the National Police Service has failed? Is it that we are in a state of emergency? Is the scenario that is ensuing right now within the country, does it really deserve the deployment of the Kenya Defence Forces? Those are the questions we are waiting for the court to rule on.
Yeah, and the court papers faulted the state for failing to demonstrate that the National Police have been overwhelmed or are incapable of dealing with any peaceful protests. And from the Tuesday pictures that we saw, there was an element of destruction of property when you looked at, City Hall being on fire, yes. The Parliament also, sections of Parliament, being destroyed, yeah. The Senate and what have you, the Supreme Court as well. In terms of the police's ability to control that, when we talk about, persons losing their lives as well as destruction of property, surely visually somebody could have argued that in fact the police seemed to have been overwhelmed. Well,
it's a proper argument, Lillian, but we have to contextualize this debate and this whole scenario, because what has been happening with the protesters and the police and the claim that the police have been overwhelmed, I don't think, in my view, warrants the KDF. For this reason, the protests, even though they were widespread, we didn't see the magnitude of destruction of property, loss of lives, telling us that they have lost faith in the National Police Service and they are incapable. We shouldn't deploy the KDF. Okay. For the simple reason that the Kenya Defence Forces are not trained to deal with civilians. They are purposely trained to deal with external forces who are a threat to the sovereignty of our nation. Therein, Lillian, when the Cabinet Secretary issued that Gazette notice, he never bothered to explain the reasons. The National Assembly, further, and these are some of the reasons why we read mischief. The National Assembly and its proceedings, they were not public. Yeah. There has been no communication as to the reasons why that decision was taken and as to why the request was made. Mm-hmm. The CS has not told the country really that the situation as it is so grievous and dangerous, yeah, that if we don't involve the KDF, we are going to slide into anarchy. Mm-hmm. They have not done that. And what about the Ministry of Defence's counsel, terming these chaos as characteristic of something that has been experienced in the country before, and that this situation falls squarely in a situation of emergency, that in such a state of emergency, this kind of deployment has in fact been done before. So this is not a unique case where, for instance, the Ministry of Defense... Lillian, there is some dishonesty with the Ministry of Defense and the government at large, the executive arm, because when such a scenario happens, there is no need of secrecy. Mm-hmm. We are living in this nation unless something has happened outside what we of requesting or even deploying the KDF. Right. And what happened, maybe they think in their wisdom was so much, is maybe the occupation of the National Assembly, mm-hmm, by protesters, right, on Tuesday. And whereas that has never happened in this country, where such an institution has been occupied by protesters, the government should also ask themselves, how did this happen? Uh-huh. How did we get here? And after asking that question, because the government and at large the executive specifically, they had the benefit of intelligence, of National Intelligence Service, they ought to have known this would happen. And it is not actually a matter of National Intelligence Service, Lillian, uh-huh, because it was actually in the public domain. Yeah. Everybody was saying, there was actually a hashtag Occupy State House. Uh-huh. So therefore, the government knew that these people are actually intending to finally reach State House. But they ought to tell us, is the National Police Service incapable? Were they overwhelmed? That is the actual thing that they need to tell us. Right. And, the High Court has certified this as urgent, this petition filed by the Law Society of Kenya. We are still waiting to hear what exactly the ruling on this issue is. But in terms of the LSK's argument that the country may be receding into a police state, in layman's language, elaborate to us what that translates into. We are actually fearing that we would say in terms of percentage, 30%, 40% we are almost a police state. The reason I am saying that before I explain what that is, the government, or through the Cabinet Secretary for Defense, did actually deploy the military. And we have actually seen them today in the streets. At some point, they were near National Stadium.
Yes.
At some point, they actually made their way into the city, and they made rounds. I don't know whether they are back or whether they are waiting for the ruling by Justice Mugambi. But a police state is not something that any Kenyan or even the president or leaders would wish that we have. Because in a police state, normally, there are some rights that normally are suspended. You remember when areas like Boni Forest, when terrorism was so much alive,
yes,
the government would issue curfew. And it would issue curfew from this period to this period. You're not supposed to be outside. From this period to this period, you're supposed to be within your estate. And a police state would be so grievous such that if we slide there, we would not maybe be able to bounce back socially, politically, and even economically, because businesses will be closed and we will only be opened when government says and when government wants. And then you may find some police officers or security officers taking advantage of that. The criminals also, they may also want to take advantage of that, because at that time, several things are suspended. The police are normally outside walking all over. You will be frisked, even if you are not necessarily frisked. People will be asked for their IDs. You'll be asked where you're going, where you're moving from, and therefore our right to movement will also maybe be crippled a little bit. Yes. Now,
it's generally acknowledged that the military are not professionally trained in dealing with internal security matters which involve civilians. And what we're seeing is that even as they do their rounds, there's a general sense that there's a heavy military presence. Yes. Going by what this ruling, decides as regards the military's involvement or lack of it thereof, let's look at those two scenarios. Let's begin with the military's involvement in quelling, the violence or controlling the protests that are now countrywide, as you can see. In terms of how far, who is their central point of command in such a case? You're saying that indeed a police state would then mean that movement is controlled. Perhaps there would be a curfew therein. So yes. In terms of the military's involvement in all of this, what are the extreme cases that are likely to be experienced in such a case, and who then would be the central point of command that would put an end to all of this? Yes,
Lillian, actually that is the question that the LSK also is asking the court. Is asking the Cabinet Secretary for Defense, and we are waiting for Justice Mugabe to rule. Because, as I have said, when the Cabinet Secretary is requesting for approval of deployment of the KDF, it is normally not just for the sake of it. It is normally something that is thought through. The National Security Council, I believe, have to sit and they have to see this area at this time and for this period of time has to be deployed with Kenya Defense Forces. Now, we are in a quagmire, and we actually don't know when the Kenya Defense Forces personnel land into our streets and they fight the National Police Service personnel, who is going to lead the other. I mean, the National Police Service might want to say, we have been leading this, we are on this, and therefore we know what we are doing. Secondly, the Kenya Defense Forces might come and say, we are the big brothers, we are going to do this, we have come to reinforce, you guys have actually been unable. And therefore, you will remember a while back when we had a situation at Westgate. Yes. When the Kenya Defense Forces were deployed there, and there was actually a problem with the then leadership of the police service and the KDF, because, and actually people have later on argued that there might have been some mishaps that made that scenario worse for lack of leadership. And therefore, the failures that are being created by the Cabinet Secretary for Defense might actually be felt harder when the defense forces get into the streets, because they cannot get into the streets without a structure. And if they get out without a structure, be sure that the situation will be more messed up than they have found it, because first they will have a commotion or a mishap within themselves, whereas they are supposed to be on the streets together to safeguard life and protect property.
All right, and we're looking at pictures from different parts of the country as anti-finance bill protests continue. You will remember that as of yesterday, President William Ruto declined to sign the Finance Bill 2024 and also proposed a raft of amendments to the bill, which MPs will now have to consider. And in returning the bill, the president will point out key areas that need to be altered. And we're looking at what the president said in a televised address from State House Nairobi yesterday, where he said he had listened to the views of Kenyans. The president pointed out that he would go by the wishes of the people. But even after that, we still continue to see protests underway in parts of the country. We're getting pictures to you from Migori, Makueni, Mombasa, and even here in Nairobi County, where sections of roads in the city have been barricaded, heavy security presence in major roads as protesters continue to demonstrate in parts of the country, albeit peacefully. We are seeing heavy security presence, roads barricaded, motorists being turned around as they try to access different parts of the city. Businesses closed in most parts of the central business district, as well as other parts of the country. And you're seeing there several arrests have been made as well, partly of protesters, as well as persons that may be engaging in some criminal activities. There are people who have protested over their businesses being looted into destruction of property as well. And so police are at bay there as they try to control movement within parts of the CBD. We also know that the High Court was supposed to be making a ruling at 3 p.m. That is exactly 45 minutes ago. We have not heard from the High Court as well. We're still waiting to hear on its ruling regarding the deployment of military officers to control the ongoing protests in parts of the country after a Gazette notice from Defense CS Aidan Duale, which announced the deployment of the military following the anti-finance bill protests. The High Court will be making a ruling on whether or not this is in fact legal, as the LSK moved to court to say that there was absolutely no reason why the military should be deployed, as there was no emergency, unrest, or instability that had been officially declared to warrant the deployment of military officers. And I'm with Ngunju Mathenge. He is a constitutional lawyer. As we look into the legality of military presence to help police control the ongoing protests that have been experienced. Now, in terms of these protests, Ngunju, we do know of previous protests that have happened, following the election of the current government or its being in power. But we have not seen an extreme case where the military has actually been called to come to help quell the protests or control the protests or even assist the police. Why, in your opinion, is there a sense that these protests this time round, albeit the fact that they started with a very calm mood, have now morphed into something that could pose a threat to the security of the country? We're seeing a lot of security around State House and the roads leading into State House. We know of hashtags that implied that there would actually be an attempt to march into State House. So why this time? Why the sense that this time there is an actual threat that would then need the military to be deployed or involved?
First, Lillian, I think the problem we are experiencing right now and the scenario that we are experiencing right now has never been experienced in this country. No protest or demonstration has ever reached the extent of touching institutions. You remember City Hall was set ablaze, a part of it, the National Assembly the same, and also the office of the Chief Justice was also set ablaze, or a part of it, But in my own opinion, why I think that the security officers and the security think that this is grievous or it's something to be taken serious, the people protesting are very unique, Lillian. The people protesting have said, and it can actually be seen, they are leaderless. The people protesting, as they are saying, they have no party, they have no group, they have no, a central source of command. They have no central place where they report. They have no a single mode of communication. And therefore, the security apparatus of the country are unable to deal with them because they cannot hold any single person who was on the streets accountable. You cannot say that this is an opposition-led demonstration, this is a so-and-so or a civil rights-led demonstration, and therefore you go and question or pick up a few civil rights activists or groups. But it is actually very dangerous, and I think the security apparatus understand the magnitude.
Right.
Yes.
Now, and you know, the bone of contention here is the finance bill.
Yes.
Now, the president declined to sign it. And the question now is what happens? For as long as this now hangs in the air, we are seeing sections continue to say that we do not know where we lie with all of this. So, you know, walk us through what happens. Clause 6 of the Constitution states that if the president refuses to sign the bill and fails to return it to Parliament within 14 days, the bill will be considered law. We know that he has failed to sign it, but has returned it to Parliament. Parliament is on recess.
Yes.
What are the scenarios we're looking at going forward?
So first, Lillian, you allow me to refer you and the country to Article 115. And therein, that is where the provisions that gives the president powers to assent or refer the bill. So once the bill, if I may go a little bit back, when the bill is formulated, it is taken or introduced to Parliament. Then, in this case, it was the National Assembly and not Senate. When the finance bill was formulated, it was presented a first reading to the National Assembly.
Yes.
And then it went back to the committee for public participation, and they generated a report. When that happened, they came for the second reading. The second reading is where they were supposed to vote on the bill. And you remember when they were voting for the bill, a day before, there had been groupings of different political formations, some supporting and some rejecting. And eventually, it did pass. On the same day, the bill went for a third reading.
Yes.
Where it went and it was read clause by clause. Every clause was read, and the MPs either voted yes or no to the clause. And there were no amendments. Therefore, all clauses were voted and they passed. After the third reading, the next point of call, where we were now on Tuesday, is that the bill was supposed to be processed and taken and presented before the president for ascension, so that he assents. And the same was processed and taken to the president. And the president at that particular moment had two options. When such a bill is presented before the president, two options are on his table. He can either assent so that within 14 days it becomes law. He can also equally decide that I'm not assenting, I have some reservations and some recommendations that I think I am proposing into this bill to make it better. And therefore, he ought to write a memorandum, like the one he did last evening.
Right.
And when he writes that memorandum, he directs it to the National Assembly so that indicating point by point where he disagrees and his recommendation. And therefore, it goes back to Parliament, to the National Assembly. When it goes to the National Assembly is supposed to reconvene and consider the president's recommendations and reservations. When they do that, they also have two options, or three options rather. They can either include all the president's reservations and recommendations and therefore pass it with those recommendations. They can do partially. They can say, these recommendations, they are good, but not all of them. We are going to pick recommendations A, B, C, and then the rest we are not. So we also, that is the second option. The third option, they can entirely decide that all those recommendations and reservations of the president are not warranted, and according to the wisdom of the House, we don't agree with them, and then they vote. But there is a catch here, that when they put in the recommendations of the president, and or when they put either a few of them or all of them, they are supposed to do voting. And that vote has to, so that those recommendations can actually sail through and be part of the bill, they have to be voted by at least 2/3 of the members.
Okay.
And therefore that's a big, a tall order. But in this particular circumstance, nothing like this has ever happened. The president, in his memorandum last evening, said, and he proposed, the withdrawal of a bill. First, that the president cannot withdraw a bill because it's unheard of. It is nowhere in law.
Okay.
But he also said that in consultation and in agreement with the members of parliament behind him when he was making the speech, so those members of parliament are the one that can go back into parliament, and the only thing that they can do, because the president said that he has listened to Kenyans, and Kenyans don't want the bill entirely. That's what he said.
Yes.
Entirely. Therefore, what entirely means is that every clause of that bill will be deleted, and therefore the mover of the bill, that is the majority leader Kimani Ichung'wah, has two options. He can either request and send a request to the Speaker of the National Assembly requesting to withdraw the bill entirely. Or he can propose amendments in terms of deletion, and therefore the process will now go back to second reading, where the National Assembly and all the members will be read the amendments. And when the amendments are read, the amendments will be very funny, Lillian, because it will be saying that the mover, or it is proposed to be deleted, this clause.
This is a lot of technical jargon for Kenyans. The back and forth, the mover of the bill, requesting for the bill to be withdrawn entirely, back and forth. But essentially what is happening is the scenes that we're seeing on our screens continue.
Yes, they are not going anywhere.
They're not going anywhere. There is no end in sight. So, to simplify this entire process, is there an end in sight?
There is an end in sight, but we cannot see it because the Speaker of the National Assembly has not called his troops. And what maybe the president would have gone further to say yesterday, he ought to have gone further and said, I am also requesting, because he cannot direct the Speaker, because the Speaker is independent and leads an independent arm of government. I am requesting the Speaker, who is the leader of the National Assembly, to recall his troops, to recall the members of the National Assembly from recess and consider my recommendations in this memoranda. And therefore, the Speaker, considering the scenario that we are seeing and how the state has been put, because people are not working, it is actually not a good state to be in as a country. Therefore, the Speaker ought to have taken this seriously and called his members today. There is nothing difficult in that. In any case, yesterday morning they did convene immediately and executed the approval of the defense forces. So this is as serious as that.
Yeah.
The circumstances are bad, and they actually require for that sitting to be done immediately.
But you say the Speaker of the National Assembly has not recalled his troops, and it would have been wise for the President to actually call upon him to do the same. We have a 14-day timeline that we're looking at.
Yes.
Essentially, if they're not recalled, then the 14 days elapse, and then what?
And then, but you know, what the law actually says, in good interpretation, is that if the President does not assent and does also not equally send recommendations.
Right.
So if he doesn't do any of those and sleeps on his rights and his duty, within 14 days, that bill will become law. But as at now, we have actually stopped that process. The 14 days cannot begin to count. The reason, he has sent a memoranda.
Yes.
So he has activated his second obligation and duty. Now, all eyes and concentration is now in Parliament, because if the National Assembly is not reconvened and called from recess, you know, they did say that they are coming back from recess on 23rd of July.
July, yes.
And therefore, we cannot afford as a country to stay without an appropriations bill, because the finance bill, we have no problem. We will continue with the Finance Act of 2023. There's really no lacuna, but the appropriations bill has to be enacted, it has to be passed, and it has to be made law. Therefore, the Speaker of the National Assembly, the Honorable Etangula, he ought to take this matter with the seriousness and urgency that it deserves, because he's actually, according to me, putting the President in bad light, because they are taken to take orders from the President. And we would all have thought or assumed that immediately the President did that, the National Assembly being largely Kenya Kwanza, led by the President, they would move on and reconvene immediately, so that they make sure what the President has actually said happens on the ground. And they also make sure that the government that they are in and in which they form part of the majority does not fail.
Now, talking about the finance bill and its pros and cons, its importance, there are people who feel very strongly about it. In fact, as you can see on our screens, the voice of the nation and the heartbeat of the nation is totally pained towards, you know, some of the clauses here. And the President, in his televised address yesterday, said that withdrawing the bill would mean a significant hole in funding for development programs to help farmers and school teachers, among others. We're already a cash-strapped government was basically the mood of what he was saying. And therefore, you know, even as he rolled back on some tax measures previously, we also know that the Treasury has warned of a gaping budget shortfall. So going back and starting this process all over again, will that really have met to the needs of the people, seeing that the government has continuously told us that we are a cash-strapped nation, that we have massive debt, the country has incurred massive debt, and therefore, even as the process continue because of some of the extremities in this finance bill, the issue that the President keeps going back to is that we are, in fact, quote unquote, a broke nation.
I don't think so, Lillian, because every year in, year out, we normally have a finance bill that we normally discuss, and there is normally a budget that is read, so that in that budget, we enumerate all our needs as a country, and we also enumerate how much they will cost us. Then we move to the appropriations bill. We appropriate what each of those heads will be given, or the amount of money that will be set aside for all those votes. And then we have the finance bill, which actually tells us where is this money that we are required in the budget, where is it going to come from? We did that in 2023. And when we did that in 2023, the budget then in 2023 was 3.8 trillion. After that budget was read and the finance bill approved, there has been a few supplementary supplementary budgets because the money was not enough. What was supposed to happen right now, Lillian, is that in the Finance Bill 2024, it had added only 300 billion into the budget that was there in 2023. Therefore, the country knew that out of 3.8 trillion that we had used last year, because of inflation, because of development so and so that we are going to add, because we have JSS teachers, because we have doctors that we added salary, we are going to be required to add into that budget 300 shillings. And therefore, this 300 billion. And therefore, this 300 billion, where is it going to come from? That is why they went for new taxation. They went and tax bread. They wanted to tax motor vehicles. But it is proper to tell Kenyans that there will be no crisis. The Finance Act 2023 is still in force until it is repealed by the Finance Act 2024, and therefore there is no cause of alarm. The only cause of alarm is that the government might not want to do the new things that they would have wanted to do 2024 going to 2025.
Yeah. Now let's talk about the LSK obtaining orders barring security agencies, including the police and intelligence officials, the agents or employees, from arresting and holding peaceful protesters. A lot of arrests, as we're seeing. Some, you'll have to give it to the security officials, are of persons that perhaps have been seen to be engaging in destruction of property. But some arrests also have been made of peaceful protesters. In terms of the arrest of such persons and those that are still in custody, what is their fate as we speak? How long are they supposed to be held for? Do they have to go through a court process to be released? Is it a bailable offense? Let's talk about those that are actually in custody but did not engage in any violence, were actually just peacefully picketing.
Yes. Yesterday, actually, you have to give it up to LSK, who have been very busy. Yesterday, LSK obtained orders from court to release 53 persons who are arrested with no justified cause. And out of the 53, only 6 were arraigned in court. And those ones were arraigned for reasons of arson, and therefore those ones were processed and they were issued with cash bail. Several others were later arraigned yesterday afternoon. But just to bring you and the nation to speed, when you are actually protesting out there and demonstrating and exercising your rights under Article 37, it is good that you do it within the confines of the law. And it is also equally important that the security agencies and apparatus, they also make sure that they don't infringe on the rights of protesters who are peaceful and unarmed. Reason, over the past few days when the protests have been rife, we have seen several people who have been arrested and abducted. And that is against the law, because what the law says in Article 49, when you are arrested, Lillian, you have 24 hours. The police have 24 hours to arraign you in court and to process you with a plea so that your charges are read, and then you either plead guilty or not guilty. And then what Kenyans should also know, especially those protesting, is that once you are arrested, you also have a right to remain silent, you also have a right to bail, and you also have a right to representation. You can ask that you may be granted the permission to call a counsel of your own liking, or you can call the LSK toll-free number. But what the protesters and the police should know, that each of them have rights. And therefore, where the rights of peaceful Kenyans end, that's where the rights of the police officer to take responsibility and to maintain law and order starts. Yeah, and there's also a concern of where cybercrime. I mean, there's the line, where do we draw the line as regards what is cybercrime and what is not, and what is,
perhaps, the concern around persons that are supporting the protests on their social media now being told to be, aggressors or to be, in support of the destruction of property, in support of treason, persons that were actually not physically present at the protests, but because of using their social media accounts have also been arrested. Some actually still missing. In terms of what the law says about that, how you can use your social media account even when not physically present at these protests, and how and what where to draw the line as regards what could actually lead into a potential arrest.
Yes. One, in Kenya, we are regulated by, first, the Constitution. That is where we draw the right to privacy and all these other rights. But then, specifically, as you have rightfully said, those cyber crimes or alleged cyber crimes by the police, it is good that the police also rely on the Cyber Crimes Act and also the Data Protection Act. Lillian, in this nation, we are normally not short of laws because we have so many of them, but we don't maybe mostly execute them. But those who have been arrested for maybe things that they have posted on social media, what they may be looking at and what maybe the security agencies may be looking at is either they violated the privacy of some people. Maybe you remember a while ago people attempted to share contacts of senior people or leaders, the MPs and people in government. And some of the security apparatus interpreted that as an infringement of the right to privacy. Equally, the right to, or the Cyber Crimes Act also enumerates a lot of rights, and also how you can be able to use your social media without infringing on the rights of other people. But may I say at this point, the government or the security apparatus, I think, they are using old ways to deal with very new or emerging issues or trends. Because the trend that is actually on Twitter, X rather, you can actually see people posting and airing their opinions. You join a Twitter space and you find people are airing their opinions in whatever language they put, but how are the police or the government dealing with that? Because these are not usual protesters that you will find in the streets with stones, but they are actually making their voice heard just with a phone. Maybe someone is in their bed sitter, maybe someone is seated at home or in their workplace, but they are actually demonstrating more and making their voices heard more than the people on the street. So the government also needs to know these are new trends, and therefore we need to come up with new ways and methods of handling these things.
And Wakili, there's this common, and you've talked into that, you've spoken into the fact that they are leaderless, they are tribeless. However, when you look at social media, there is also a trend of fake news there, where you see circulars that are being circulated from high offices that are in fact fake, where you see resignations of persons in key positions being circulated that are in fact fake. So as we speak about protesters that are leaderless, that are tribeless, that are speaking as one voice, as the Gen Zs, and now this has become protests for all. It's for the Gen X, for the Gen Zs, for the millennials. It has actually morphed into something else. So as we look into social media and the dangers that lie therein with the circulation of fake circulars, fake intelligence reports, and the dangers that lie therein, concerns over that in itself, brewing a lot of uncontrolled chaos, which is now beyond the control of the police and even the military that is now, almost seemingly being deployed to control the chaos. Let's speak into social media and the circulation of the fake news.
Yes, and that is actually a problem because, as I've actually just said a while ago, the government needs to come up with new ways of dealing with new trends of crimes or new trends that citizens have manufactured or have started using. First, the Cyber Crimes Act makes it an offense to publish fake news or to publish false information. Therefore, it is the right, or it is within the purview of the state agencies, especially the National Police Service, to be able to come and arrest or make inquiries into the fake news that have been published by person X. But in terms of consuming this information, public consuming this information because it is fake, and that is where maybe the danger might be a lot. How can you be able to verify, or how can I myself be able to verify some information I've just read on X, or something that has been published that person so and so has resigned?
I'll have you hold your thoughts, Wakili. Let's listen into what is happening there. We're seeing tear gas canisters being lobbed there. That is the Central Business District. Let's listen in. CBD there, where we're seeing heavy police presence, several arrests being made and tear gas canisters being lobbed there. The CBD had little activity going on. We've seen a few commuters milling in and about the CBD. We've seen scenes from City Hall, the Nairobi County Green Army members running up and about, removing debris which had been littered on the road from the anti-finance protests. We're seeing major roads within Nairobi city barricaded by police, even as we see public service vehicles going in and out. However, very little traffic presence being seen in those areas. In downtown areas, earlier we saw pictures from Moi Avenue, Tomboya, Ronald Ngala, Mfangano streets. The areas were almost empty. Most businesses closed there, and very few people milling about, probably leaving the city center. On my way here to work as well, outside our offices here and towards State House, heavy police presence there. And these are roads that are normally full of traffic around this time. Police presence there, police in uniform spotted in various parts of the city, as well as Mombasa, Kisumu, Nyeri, and of course all roads leading to Parliament sealed off with heavy police presence around the buildings. Police are blocking vehicles and pedestrians seeking to gain access through any of the sealed off roads, including Parliament Road, a section of Harambee Avenue, as well as Cardinal Otunga. At the same time, police have mounted security checks on all roads leading to State House, Nairobi. And this, of course, following demonstrations by the Gen Z, which have now invited millennials, Gen X, and everybody else who chooses to participate in the anti-finance bill protests. And this, of course, coming despite President William Ruto's decision to send the contentious finance bill back to Parliament. And this is what we're seeing as of now. We have seen several arrests that have been made. We've seen anti-riot police turning away motorists, border riders, as well as pedestrians. And the roads affected around, the city here in Nairobi include Processional Way, Valley Road, Jakaya Kikwete Road, Dennis Pritt Road, State House Avenue, and adjacent feeder roads. Earlier today, we saw Kenya Defence Forces on standby at Nyayo Stadium, Nairobi. This, of course, ahead of any planned protests in the capital. And as of now, we were waiting for word from the High Court regarding a ruling on whether or not the deployment of the Kenya Defence Forces is legal, or whether that would in fact take place following a Gazette notice by Aden Duale, Defence CS. And, today's mood rather relatively calm following Tuesday's occurrences where we saw destruction of property, including Parliament buildings, including the Supreme Court. Part of City Hall was on fire as well. And so today, a relatively calmer day, although we have seen police engage protesters in running battles. Arrests have been made. We have seen lobbing of tear gas as well. And as of now, what we are awaiting is word from the High Court as to whether or not the KDF will be deployed. The LSK moved to court to contest this, saying that this was in fact illegal and that there was no state of emergency warranting the need of the deployment of the KDF, as what was actually happening are peaceful protests, and that Kenyans do in fact have a right to protest peacefully. We are going to be waiting to hear whether the High Court will give a way forward regarding that. But as of now, protests are underway in different parts of the country, even as KDF officers remain on standby, patrolling different parts of Nairobi where we have seen them, and police continue to cordon off roads leading to State House, Nairobi. People continue, of course, to express their sentiments around the contentious finance bill on sections of social media, on X. And even as that continues, we will wait to see whether or not the LSK will have its day in asking that the KDF are held off, as no such occurrence, according to the LSK, has happened since the 1982 coup. President William Ruto yesterday spoke in a televised address to the nation, where he said that he had the voice of the people and had in fact declined to sign the Finance Bill 2024. He proposed of course, a raft of amendments to the bill. But what we do know of now is that Parliament is, in fact, in recess. The President, in his televised address yesterday, proposed that within the next 14 days, a multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder engagement be held with a view to chart the way forward on matters relating to the content of this bill. At the same time, President Ruto has directed that further austerity measures be taken to reduce expenditure, stating, or rather starting with the Executive Office of the President and extending to the entire executive. He directed that operational expenditure in the presidency be reduced to remove allocations for the travel budget, hospitality and buying of vehicles, renovations and other expenditure. He also directed that Parliament, the judiciary and county governments work with the National Treasury and undertake budget cuts to ensure that the government achieves what, he said he has always advocated for, which is living within our means. And he also said that as this important conversation continues, he intends to continue with the foundational principles upon which this nation is founded, which is constitutionalism. But still, the protesters continue undeterred to protest against harsh economic times, saying that the measures that have been effected so far have not yielded results, and that the heartbeat of the nation still remains a very pained nation, talking about high cost of living and talking about the Kenyan really feeling the burden of some of these decisions. And therefore, we are looking at several parts of the city here in Nairobi where a handful of protesters are milling about. But of course, the police keeping a very keen eye on ensuring that the scenes that were witnessed on Tuesday are not witnessed. We have had the president speak about the destruction of property, public property, amounting to treason, and therefore very heavy police presence, the police sealing off major roads and ensuring that no destruction of property will happen today. We are awaiting for word from the High Court, where the LSK has moved after Defense CS Aden Duale announced the deployment of the military to help in controlling the security situation following the violent protests that have been experienced in parts of the country in protesting of the finance bill. The LSK in its court papers arguing that no emergency unrest or instability has been officially declared to warrant the deployment of the KDF. And therefore, in their court papers, the LSK did move to fault the state for failing to demonstrate that the national police had in fact been overwhelmed. Irrespective of that, we have seen pockets of the military doing their rounds as we await the High Court's ruling on this matter. Wakili, it is an hour and a half later, still no word from
yes,
the High Court as regards the issue to do with the KDF, and it is slowly turning into nightfall.
Yes.
And still this hangs at bay. We do not know what to expect as of now.
Yes, that is Justice Mugambi, but sometimes you understand the pressure that our judicial officers sometimes find themselves in. But of course, we have faith in the judiciary and the officers, and particularly at this point, faith in the Honorable Justice Mugambi, who had all the parties who were before him this morning, and the oral hearings went up until early afternoon.
Yeah, and over 1,000, I'm seeing actually over 1,000 people have joined the virtual proceedings for the case of the LSK versus CS Duale.
Yes. And maybe that is also one of the reasons, because normally we are not used to be over 200 in court, in one particular court link. And maybe those are some of the technical issues he's facing. We don't want to speculate, but definitely he has to give some direction. He will give directions whether the ruling is ready, whether it is not ready, and when he will deliver it. But definitely before the end of the day, whether it is midnight or whatever time, before he leaves office, I am sure he will have given directions on that.
And talking about, as we wait for this ruling, the government through the Attorney General, Justin Muturi, defended the deployment of the KDF on grounds that the law was followed in the publication of the Gazette notice, but the LSK disagrees.
Yes, we disagree, and the reason why there is that disagreement is that the Gazette notice was there for everyone to see it on the night of Tuesday night. And it was also there for everybody to see that it had not been approved. Parliament had not discussed that prior to the issuance of that Gazette notice, and Parliament actually sat after the fact, and they sat and passed it retrospectively, which cannot work, because the law of or the principle of how laws are formulated is that you cannot begin with the fact and then you promulgate a law that will now govern what you already did. No. That is not how it works. You have to follow the procedure, and if you don't follow the procedure that is set, you are about to fail. And those were the arguments before the court this morning. And the defense, that is the Attorney General and the CS, through their representatives, they tried to defend the same, but I don't want to preempt what Justice Mugabe is going to say in his ruling, But in my own opinion, that was a very wrong move. You cannot execute or you cannot pass a law and then, or rather gazette a gazette notice, and then you follow approving on the following day. That is not just right, and those are the reasons why actually Kenyans are actually maybe on the streets, and they're saying we don't have faith, or we don't actually trust the authorities, because you tell us one thing today, the following day you will do exactly the opposite. Therefore, those are the reasons, because you cannot tell us that a whole cabinet secretary can gazette deployment of police officers at night, and then the following day the parliament can come and try to, for lack of a better word, sanitize that process. It cannot be, unless we have just slided maybe into lawlessness and disobedience of rule of law. We have to follow procedure. Yeah,
let's talk about the fact that the National Assembly also approved, now moving away from the Attorney General, the National Assembly also approved the deployment of the Kenya Defence Forces to support the police, and this is where your bone of contention lies. Yes. In when the National Assembly was actually brought in as regards this Gazette notice, and they're approving of the deployment of the Kenya Defence Forces to support police amid ongoing anti-finance bill protests. The National Assembly, are the representatives of the people, and therefore by them approving the
You do know that the legislature is independent, or rather it is supposed to be independent. As to whether the current legislature is independent is debatable.
And actually there was an MP who criticized this decision on his X account, saying this was done without the media, without most members, without proper debate. In a record 30 minutes, the National Assembly had actually approved for the deployment of the KDF, or the deployment of the KDF without indicating where, why, or for what period.
Yes, and that those are some of the reasons that we actually, that also LSK actually presented before court. The issue of deployment of the KDF is not a small issue. It is actually a very serious issue. That is the last resort of defense as a country. And therefore, if we are unleashing it, we have to be very sure of what we want to do. We have to be very sure that the situation warrants their deployment. And we are saying that according to where we sit, we don't see as if this circumstance warrants their deployment. Because first, the circumstances as they are, you cannot have protesters protest on, I think, 2 days last week and 1 week on this week, 1 day this week, and then you unleash on them Kenya Defence Forces.
Hold that thought, Wakili. Let's listen in. We are seeing tension there in the CBD here in Nairobi. Let's listen in to what is happening there. And in news just in, we're getting reports that the High Court ruling as regards whether or not the KDF will be deployed has been pushed to 5/12. 5:20 p.m. That is, of course, following the Law Society of Kenya moving to court, protesting the government's decision to deploy KDF officers in the wake of anti-finance bill protests. The ruling by Judge Lawrence Mugambi has been moved to 5:20 p.m. We are awaiting that. High Court Judge Lawrence Mugambi will this evening at 5:20 p.m. deliver a ruling on whether he will suspend government decision to deploy KDF officers or not. The judge will give out directions after hearing parties in the case. LSK, through its president Faith Odhiambo, insisted that the deployment of officers is unconstitutional and is meant to scare and intimidate Kenyans not to exercise their constitutional rights. However, the Attorney General and the Ministry of Defense lawyers submitted that there is need to have the KDF officers, adding that there is, in fact, a state of emergency in the country. And according to the respondents, deployment of KDF officers has been done before, and this is not the first case. They argued that there are no irregularities in the Gazette notice issued by Defense CS Aidan Duale. We are waiting that ruling by the High Court at exactly 5:20 p.m. this evening. The ruling was supposed to be made at 3 p.m., but there has been a delay in that, and we are just about under an hour away to hear what the court rules on this matter. Wakili,
yes,
we have up to 5:20 to hear what the High Court has ruled as regards the KDF. But even as we wait for that, we're seeing, pictures coming showing that, there is no end in sight as regards to whether people will be leaving the CBD or not. We're still seeing the police trying to contain people there, and therefore this ruling will make a difference as regards what is going to be happening within the city center, and even the presence of pockets of the military that we've seen. Once the ruling is out, if it does rule in favor of the LSK, do we then expect not to see these people milling about anymore?
Yes, first, I think the magnitude of protests and demonstrations today have scaled down. You cannot compare them with Tuesday's or last week's demonstrations. Therefore, even as we wait for the ruling by the Honorable Justice Mugambi, it is also good to marry that with the circumstances of the ground, that it is actually no longer necessary to deploy such forces or Kenya Defence Forces to the streets or within the confines of our republic. However, in the wisdom of the National Security Council and the CS for Defense, they thought it twice to have this deployment. And the question, the real question, or the elephant in the room is why? Because the magnitude of the protests have actually gone down. There is no circumstance that ushered or showed instability or unruliness or how lawlessness had maybe declined in a way that required deployment of the Kenya Defence Forces. So the questions that really begs is, why is the government hell-bent on deploying the defence forces on its citizens? And that is why I'm asking, is there something that we don't know, or is there something that they are not telling us? Because if you look at the situation and the circumstances that we have been seeing the entire of today and those of Tuesday, I don't think there has been anything as to show or as to necessitate deployment of KDF. Maybe, just maybe, the infiltration or the occupation of State House by civilians and the touching of a part of City Hall and the Supreme Court building or outside Supreme Court. Maybe that is what necessitated. But really, is that how fast we can be able to deploy the defense forces? I don't think so.
And speaking of the Kenya Defence Forces, they were seen patrolling city streets on Thursday, that is today, hours before the High Court delivered its ruling, and therefore they are, or rather have still been seen patrolling, city streets before this ruling is made by the High Court on whether to suspend their deployment, or rather to suspend the deployment of the military as part of reinforcement plans to neutralize chaotic scenes during the anti-finance bill demonstrations. And what we saw earlier was the KDF personnel snaking through protesters, but they did stay short of engaging them. And the deployment of the military to quell protests has been deemed unconditional by a section of leaders and Kenyans. However, police, on the other hand, continue to lob tear gas canisters as pockets of protesters continue to make their way around the city. And of course, for those attempting to access the CBD, they are also being kept at bay by the tear gas. But unlike Tuesday's protest, when the city was full of thousands of protesters by 2 p.m., today seems to be a different day. Police have managed to keep protesters out of the city, and the number of protesters are visibly low as compared to those that were witnessed on Tuesday. That turned violent. Let's listen into what's happening in Eldoret. Okay, those are pictures from Eldoret, and those are earlier pictures that were in Eldoret. Peaceful protesters meeting there and probably, just waiting for a go-ahead from whoever it is that is directing them on what to do. They're also holding placards that read peace. Here in the city, that is Nairobi, we've seen police arresting some protesters who are participating in the demos. And High Court Judge Lawrence Mugambi will make the ruling at 5:20 after hearing the parties in the case filed by the Law Society of Kenya seeking to block the deployment of the military to assist the police. The deployment of the military was seen as necessary by Defense CS Aidan Duale following Tuesday's protests, where protesters in their hundreds engaged in violent protests in parts of the CBD. But the LSK, through its president, Faith Odhiambo, has argued that the deployment of KDF in the CBD is unconstitutional, and she has insisted, and the LSK in its entirety has insisted, that the procedure undertaken for approval was merely quote-unquote cosmetic. And the LSK president also told the court that the Gazette notice should have been given 24 hours after Parliament's approval. She did go on to say that what we are seeing, quote unquote, is Parliament and the executive treating us to a circus to cover up. She also said that such a scenario has never been seen since the 1982 coup. Now, this Gazette notice by Aidan Duale, the Defense CS, authorizing the deployment of the military, implies that police were overwhelmed in many parts of the country, or at least that's what the LSK argues is the case, but says that that was not in fact the case, that the police are capable of handling the situation of peaceful protesters, and therefore the support of the Kenya Defence Forces is actually not necessary, as it would actually amount to intimidation and what would be seen as a police state. Wakili, earlier we were talking about the lack of public participation, the fact that the media was actually not involved when the National Assembly was voting to approve the Gazette notice, or this move by Aidan Duale, the Defense CS, to call on the KDF to move in to assist the National Police Service?
You see, when something is, we are a country governed by the rule of law, really, and that is why we have institutions like the National Assembly, and that is why there would be a law, that is Article 241, and equally the Kenya Defence Forces Act, which also speaks to the procedure, the procedure that the Cabinet Secretary for Defence may use in requesting for approval of deployment and also speaks into how that deployment is going to happen. Now, the reason why this thing is normally taken to Parliament is because of public participation, because you remember Article 2 of the Constitution says that the Constitution is supreme, and that the people can either exercise their power directly or indirectly through their elected representatives. Now, when it goes to Parliament, it is a form of public participation, so that members of Parliament are able to weigh in on the reasons that the National Security Council or the Cabinet Secretary feels that we need to deploy the police. And in that request, the Cabinet Secretary ought to inform the National Assembly and at large now the public, because they are the public representatives, why we are deploying, why we think the situation is dire and we need reinforcement and deployment of Kenya Defence Forces. And he also informs the public through the National Assembly when that deployment is needed and where. If those three things or those three elements are not there, then it is vague and we are opening the floodgates of a police state.
Yes, and we spoke about the time frame as well. It is not clear for how long.
It is actually not clear because the way it is right now, we actually don't know for how long. The Gazette notice does not speak for how long. It does not speak for a specific part of our country that that deployment is going to happen, and it equally does not say why. And therefore, we are all left to assume and to guess and make guesswork. But remember, security apparatus cannot work with guesswork. If you want to slide into anarchy very fast, try uncertainty with security forces, because if they don't have a proper command, there are all reasons and all possibilities of sliding into anarchy. So these are some of the things that the government and largely the executive needs to know, that when we are dealing with such an issue, it is good and it is proper advice that they deal with it in a more restrained manner. They need to consult. I don't know where the Honorable Attorney General was in this particular case, because he ought to have advised the President, he ought to have advised the National Security Council, and he also ought to have advised the Cabinet Secretary for Defense, so that such a scenario does not happen, where we are left to guess. The leadership of the defense forces, they are left to just come on the streets, on whatever street you can imagine. They are not even elected legally. Yeah, let's talk about the conflicting of roles and the rules that the military then, if at all, this petition, is in favor, rather, or the LSK doesn't have its day, and the KDF is in fact deployed in terms of it assisting the National Police Service. In terms of the rules that they must adhere to, we're talking about conflicting of roles and what the police can do and what the military cannot do. We're talking about, for instance, arrests. If a military officer arrests a civilian, should they then hand them over to the police? How then to avoid a situation where there will be conflicting roles, and whether they have a set of rules that or guidelines that they, now will be, called upon to adhere to if they are in fact deployed? Those are some of the issues that the Cabinet Secretary did not address himself to, because he never asked himself, when I said the troops, or when we deploy the troops to the streets, who is going to take charge? Is it the National Police? Is it the Defense Forces? And because the Kenya Defense Forces do not have holding cells, they do not have police stations. I mean, they do not have stations where they can keep civilians. They cannot prosecute civilians. So are they going to make arrests? And when they arrest, are they going to take people to prison? Where are they going to take people to? Are they going to take them to court tomorrow? Are they going to take them to police stations or hand them over to the National Police Service? So these are some of the questions that ought to have been answered. And the reason we are in this quagmire, and I'll say maybe in the up to time, is lack of consultation, and I think, for lack of a better word, lack of competence, because that Gazette notice was done in a rush. The Parliament the following morning rushed, and you have had several members of Parliament saying they were also not informed the way they are used to be informed to be in Parliament. So we actually even don't know whether there was quorum in Parliament. Yeah. We don't know whether it was debated. We don't know whether they followed their own standing orders, because it was actually in darkness, and we also don't have a communication from the Speaker. Yeah. So it is outrightly wrong for such a scenario to happen. It's actually very sad that a country which is a young democracy, but a democracy that is thriving, to slide into such uncertainty. And
let's go back to the issue we were talking about earlier. You know, more arrests continue to be made even as the protests continue. And there's the growing concern over police arresting protesters and holding them incommunicado. Many families are reporting their persons missing. Yes. People talking about persons that have been held days on end. Yes. And therefore concerns over what they are being held over for those that did not engage in destruction of property, and what the way forward would be for families or friends or guardians that are unable to access their loved ones who are still in custody.
And it's quite sad, Lillian, that people would be actually uncertain as to the whereabouts of their kinsmen after being picked from the streets by civilian police officers. You remember when this government was coming into power, they actually vowed that there will be no more abductions. They will never use the security apparatus or government institutions to settle political scores. And they said so on and so forth. But we have experienced this firsthand. Several Kenyans being arrested, abducted, and their whereabouts not being known, and only to be found at a police station somewhere in Kajiado. Yeah, or somewhere outside Nairobi, or somewhere else. And that confirms to you that it is actually the state that has done that illegally. And actually, many people have been released without being taken to court, and they have been released unconditionally. So why were they being arrested in the first place if they are not going to be taken to court? So I would also want maybe the police to adhere to Article 49 of our Constitution, that when you arrest someone, please tell them the reason why you have arrested them, process them properly, do not manhandle or use excessive force unless it is necessary according to the law. Take them to the police station. If possible, grant those citizens bail, because it is a right. Give them police bond, release them, let them appear before a trial court, let them take plea, and their charges are read. If they are going to be granted bail by the court, fine. If they are not, fine. But let the due process take course as established by the law.
Right, and as of now, only a few minutes to almost just under an hour to when the High Court will declare its stand on whether or not the KDF will be deployed. As we await that ruling from Justice Mugambi, we are looking at the situation in various parts of the country. The pictures on your screen are from the Nairobi CBD, where police presence is heavy as police keep protesters at bay. The town has not been its usual busy self for the better part of the day, this being Thursday, and a day after the president spoke in a televised address to the nation, saying that he had in fact heard the voice of the people. Protesters still took to the streets today and continued to protest against this finance bill, albeit the fact the president seemed to have taken a more reconciliatory approach, a more conversational approach with the protesters, saying that he was, in fact, open to dialogue. We still have seen in various parts of the country that the Gen Zs, now joined by millennials, and everybody else who chooses to be part of these protests, continues to air their opinions as regards the tax measures that were put in place there, or that were that were contentious in their opinion in that particular arrangement. And therefore, we will be following to hear from the High Court as we wait to hear whether the LSK will in fact have its day as regards whether or not the KDF is necessary in assisting the National Police Service contain the protests and the protesters in different parts of the city. Let's listen into what is happening there, whether those are pictures from earlier or not. That is Mombasa, and that was Mombasa earlier, where protesters also took to the streets, also airing their views and also chanting anti-finance bill slogans and saying that they will have their right of say heard, that they are a tired lot as regards the economic situation in the country, the cost of living, and really the fact that their voices have not been heard up to now continues to aggravate a significant lot. This moving from a Gen Z movement now to including anybody who is aggrieved as regards the state of the nation in terms of the finance bill and what it seeks to achieve, which they believe is not in the interests of the people. Police have sealed off major roads here in Nairobi County, and that continues to be the situation. And all roads headed or leading towards State House also continue to be inaccessible. The government has justified tax as a way to bring down the national debt, which currently stands at 68% of the GDP. Yet for many Kenyans, addressing the deficit hinges not on taxation, but according to what they say in their protests and the mood on social media, on addressing rampant corruption at every level of government. Protesters have talked about financial mismanagement. They've talked about lavish consumption among political elite. And this is where the bone of contention lies for many of them, among them young Kenyans, jobless, unemployed, who continue to say that enough is enough and that they want to be heard. The president yesterday, speaking to the nation in a televised address, declined to sign the Finance Bill 2024, and it was his hope, even after the deputy president spoke, that their Gen Zs and all the protesters would not take to the streets today, but that is not the case. They have, in fact, taken to the streets and continued with their anti-finance bill slogans and chants, saying that this bill will not see light of day. They call for its rejection. They call, in fact, for a rejection of the ideals that the government of the day holds. And therefore, looking at a situation where the current parliament is on recess and looking at the way forward, and the protests still ongoing, and a situation that now awaits in terms of the KDF's deployment, the ruling from the High Court, as the Defense CS feels that it is necessary for the KDF to be deployed to help quell the situation as protesters continue to take to the streets, protesting what they say is high cost of living, unemployment, and really a